Good morning and welcome to this new episode of our series of webinars dedicated to the Indo-Pacific that we have initiated at King's College. I say good morning because we are in UK, but of course it may be good afternoon or good evening if you're in Asia. After looking at the Russian view of the Indo-Pacific last month, which means last year, we will turn today to the US role in the Indo-Pacific. And we are very fortunate for that to welcome Professor Walter Ladwig, who is part of the Department of World War Studies at King's College, specializing in US foreign policy, as well as South Asian security, irregular warfare, and the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific. His teaching primarily concentrates on the conduct of statecraft and Cold War history. His first book, The Forgotten Front, Patron-Client Relationships in Counterinsurgency, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2017, where he examines the often difficult relations between the US and local governments it is supporting in counterinsurgency. I'm very sympathetic to this approach. My study of the US-Pakistan relations will precisely frame in this perspective of Orientalism. And he is currently writing a book on Indian defense policy. So we will listen to Walter for 30 minutes or so. And after that, you all, those who are connected, are welcome, are invited to ask their questions in the Q&A box. And we'll have the same time, 30 minutes, for the Q&A session. So Walter, thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Christophe, and thank you to everyone here. Before we get into the specifics of how the US and particularly the Biden administration is approaching the Indo-Pacific, I think it's first helpful to articulate a couple of macro trends that we see in the region, because I think they inform how we would assess what it is the United States is doing. And the first of these trends is what we might call the bifurcation of security and economics. So for much of the Cold War and after, the United States has been a principal, if not the principal, security provider in the Indo-Pacific through a network of bilateral alliances, as well as forward deployed military forces in places like Japan and South Korea, and at times the Philippines. The US provided a security umbrella that helped underwrite regional stability. And of course, American partners directly benefited from these actions, but so too arguably did a range of other states that essentially got to reap the benefits this security presence provided. So we might see, for example, North Korea as an exception, but even China, though not always happy with the prominent American role, was happy with the restraining effects that the American alliance had on Japanese armed forces and their growth trajectory. And moreover, and this is the big benefit, just as it has been argued that in Europe during the Cold War, the American security presence allowed traditional rivals such as France and Germany to set aside their historical differences and begin the mutually beneficial project of European integration, the security umbrella created as a consequence of American military presence in the Indo-Pacific arguably created an environment in which states that otherwise might have been concerned about each other were able to set those differences aside and engage in mutually productive economic relationships. So as a consequence, we've seen a tremendous economic integration and growth of trade throughout the Indo-Pacific, principally in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. Economies have become majorly intertwined. Now, in the beginning and throughout the early part of the post-Cold War era, the United States was also the region's major economic partner in that it was absorbing a lot of the export-led growth coming out of countries in the Indo-Pacific. So the US was the leading export market and trade partner for virtually every country in the region. So you had, if you will, the security hegemon and the economic hegemon unified in the same state that tried to advance an agenda of stability, economic liberalization, and democracy. Now today, we would see that no longer to be the case. China is the leading trade partner, if not always the top export market for most of the region's large economies. Though America's economic role is larger in absolute terms, its relative importance has shrunk, particularly with respect to the goods trade. Now, investment is a slightly different story. The US is still a leading source of FDI for most countries, but on a whole, the United States' role has relatively diminished. And as we've seen the countries of the Indo-Pacific grow richer, we see much more money flowing into arms with a significant acceleration of military spending across the board. So we see countries like China that say haven't had a meaningful naval capability for more than a century building major blue water fleets. And we've also seen an increase in the forceful contestation of territorial and maritime disputes that had laid fallow for quite some time. Most, not all, many of these though, involve China in some form or another. So you have, as Evan Feigenbaum and others have noted, an increasing bifurcation of the region with a security architecture that remains centered on the United States and an economic architecture that is increasingly China-centric. This then leads to the second important macro trend. The bifurcation that I've just described sometimes leads to conversations which suggest the emergence of a bipolar Indo-Pacific. Many commentators suggest either explicitly or implicitly that countries will ultimately have to choose to go with a US-led vision or a Chinese vision. However, this is far too simplistic a framework and one that denies agency for many of the countries in the region itself. We know full well that countries do not want to have to choose between their economic interests and their security interests. They don't want to be marshaled into one camp or another. More importantly, countries are not simply waiting around for Washington or Beijing to set the agenda. So the countries of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, for example, are setting trade standards and building norms without the participation of either China or the United States. And the region has also seen the proliferation of minilaterals. India, France, Australia, Indonesia, Japan, India, Australia, trilateral, among others, are regional groupings that do not include, again, either China or the United States. So just to sum up, we have an important region of the world in which security and economics are increasingly pointed in different directions, in which it's also not necessarily the leading states from either of those two perspectives that are shaping the rules and norms. And so this results in a complicated landscape, to be sure. So with that as a backdrop and a context, let's now pivot and talk about the United States in the Indo-Pacific. Since the early 2000s, the US has consistently attempted to leverage its alliances, its partnerships, its influence in regional institutions to preserve norms and behaviors that appeared to be under challenge. Freedom of the seas, economic openness, the advancement of democratic values, alongside long-standing American efforts to preserve regional stability and counter non-traditional security threats. As Nina Sylov has ably documented, the roots of the US approach to the Indo-Pacific can be found in the George W. Bush administration, which succeeded in forging a strategic partnership with India that in turn opened the door to greater cooperation between two countries that had previously been described as estranged democracies. And both of these countries were heavily influenced by Shinzo Abe's idea of an arc of freedom and prosperity that recognized the fundamental interconnectedness of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Under the Obama administration, we then saw the term Indo-Pacific enter into the American lexicon as part of its rebalance to Asia. And as part of these efforts, Obama sought to bolster alliances and partnerships with countries like the Philippines and Indonesia, as well as Vietnam. Multilateralism and engagement with a range of countries, even those that lacked a democratic character, was the focus of efforts. And we saw bipartisan trends across administrations, where Obama attempted to bring to fruition the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement that had been started under the Bush administration before them, seeking to ensure high standards for trade and commerce in the region. In the face of what appeared to be growing Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea and elsewhere, by the time we get to the end of the Obama years, a clear bipartisan consensus is emerging in Washington that a more forceful China policy is required. The hope or the theory that as China grew richer, it would liberalize, which had held sway since the 1990s, was increasingly untenable. So under Trump, then, we see China become the clear focus of US strategy in the Indo-Pacific, which sought to build up specific partners in a balancing coalition rather than focusing on the multilateralism per se of Obama. Trump administration, again, took on new ideas coming from Shinzo Abe, the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, and also marked out shared security interests and democratic character as a key factor, bringing like-minded states together, as well as using those characteristics to draw a clear distinction with Beijing. The archetypal example of this was the revival of the Quad. The Trump years also saw arguments with allies and economic fights with security partners, as well as, critically, the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. So then in February 2022, just under a year ago, the Biden administration then launches its own Indo-Pacific strategy, which seeks to advance a free, open, connected, prosperous, and secure region in the face of threats from climate change, resource scarcity, internal conflict, but above all, China. In the face of what the strategy describes as the most significant challenge from the region since the Second World War, the United States seeks to drive prosperity, bolster security, enhance resilience to transnational threats, and build connections both within and across the region. The idea is that this will be accomplished by upgrading American resources and presence in the Indo-Pacific, reinforcing deterrence, strengthening bilateral and multilateral partnerships, as well as enhancing the capacity of smaller states, promoting good governance, and investing in supply chain security and regional connectivity. And this approach has a lot of continuities with what has come before. The focus on China as the primary challenge to American regional interests, the outlook of the Trump years, remains. The PRC's efforts to carve out a sphere of influence is characterized in the strategy as undermining human rights and rule of law, as well as the foundations of stability and security in the region. And there's also an emphasis on the role played by US allies and partners like India, and the specific language of a free and open Indo-Pacific as a policy objective is retained. There are, however, a couple of really key differences in the Biden approach compared to Trump. The first is that allies and partners in the region assume much greater importance in the 2022 Indo-Pacific strategy, right? This gives attention to middle powers and smaller states in the region, which have not received much focus in the past. The US is now openly encouraging European interests in the Indo-Pacific. In particular, France and the UK are discussed, as well as an explicit endorsement of the EU's strategy for cooperation. So unlike Trump's focus on specific partners or the traditional hub and spokes model of bilateral US alliances, the new Biden strategy envisions a networked regional order in which many states take part in both the setting and the enforcing of regional norms. Thus, it's more akin to the Obama administration's multilateral approach. And the US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has described it as a lattice work of alliances and partnerships. The second difference then is with respect to economics. As I mentioned, the Trump administration pulled out of the TPP negotiations, which were carried on by the Japanese, but essentially for 4 years ceded economic ground, which allowed China to involve itself in trade deals covering most of the region, including with key US allies. Now, the original idea behind the TPP and its high standards approach was that China would eventually have to comply with these or end up being economically isolated in Asia. Ironically enough, we've ended up with a situation in which it is the US instead that's largely on the outside looking in. So in an effort to address this as part of its regional economic engagement, the Biden administration strategy introduces the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework as a vehicle to encourage high-quality trade that tries to ensure sufficient protection for environmental and labor standards. Okay, so that's the strategy as it's been articulated. What should we make of this? How should we assess the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy? Well, first of all, like many public strategy documents issued by the US government and other governments around the world, We would say that this is not a strategy as we would recognize it in, say, the Department of War Studies, right? It does not tell us what things will be prioritized and what things will be downplayed in order to meet objectives. And we don't get a clear chain of ends and means that will take us to the desired outcome. That critique aside, and turning to the substance, on the one hand, it's great that the White House vetted its ideas in advance with allies and even managed to bring the document out in the first place. If we think back to February last year, with the looming threat later realized of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it shows real significance that this was able to move forward and wasn't sort of lost and overtaken by events. And of course, the promises of enhanced regional engagement and new resources directed to the region are welcome. However, we can't lose sight of the fact that a string of American administrations have promised to pivot, rebalance, or otherwise prioritize the Indo-Pacific over other regions, but have repeatedly fallen short. Observers in Asia are well aware of these trends, and they are looking for action rather than talk. Now, today, I want to dig a little deeper, and I want to focus on two pillars of the strategy, which are security and prosperity. On the security front, the primary tool envisioned for responding to threats, as in the subsequent 2022 National Security Strategy released in October, is what's being called integrated deterrence. So this is the coordinated use of military and non-military tools of statecraft that are employed in consonance with allies and partners. Now, we should note that the overall concept of integrated deterrence remains somewhat vague. Thus, how this will play out in practice and what it will be capable of doing remains ambiguous. Will it be possible to use this to reassure American allies in the region in the absence of an enhancement of actual US capabilities? It's a particularly relevant question to ask when no less than the number 2 in the Pentagon, Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks, has identified the combat credibility of American forces as the cornerstone of integrated deterrence. Unfortunately, analysis of the White House's 2023 budget for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative finds continued underinvestment in the infrastructure and facilities that would be necessary for American forces to undertake distributed operations in the face of Chinese missile threats to American forward bases. And the ambiguity surrounding integrated deterrence isn't great, given that the US strategy imagines and has a very important role for allies and partners taking part. So on the one hand, enhancing cooperation with the Quad and introducing AUKUS are certainly good steps in this regard, but these countries can't make a contribution if they don't really understand what the concept is. Now, the Biden administration strategy rightly notes that one key asymmetric strength of the United States is its unrivaled network of allies and partners. But one should ask, how solid is the foundation for a strategy based around working with such partners when many governments in the region are reluctant to overtly balance against China? So India's enhanced engagement with the Quad, for example, has been a key factor in re-energizing and moving that grouping forward, but it remains the case that New Delhi is uncomfortable with security aspects of the arrangement, even in the face of an active border clash with China. So we see the group instead focusing on things like technology development and vaccines. And those are all very important. But we have the most significant grouping of regional powers not doing security because its members aren't comfortable with it. Is this an example of a partnership that's going to have a deterrent multiplier effect? Now, it's not just India where these questions can be asked. The American appetite for a much more confrontational posture towards China is not widely shared across the region. Indeed, as I mentioned before, countries do not want to be forced into a position where they have to feel like they're choosing sides between China and the United States. Now, rhetorically, American officials insist they will not put countries in the position of having to choose. But that's not always the message conveyed by American actions. A case in point can be seen in the way that both Dutch and South Korean semiconductor firms have recently been under extreme pressure from the United States to limit, if not curtail, their exports of high-end semiconductor chips and fabrication systems to China. And keep in mind, these two countries are fully paid up treaty allies of the United States. Now, I'm not suggesting that the US is wrong to do this, but it's worth asking how other countries that are not allies of the US might fare if the United States continues to increase the extraterritorial application of its export control policies and other regulatory tools targeting China. These kinds of efforts could force a choice on countries that will not be particularly happy about it. And we should also recognize, of course, that the American rhetoric on a free and open Indo-Pacific has received a relatively cool reception in Southeast Asia, where the focus is on sustaining ASEAN centrality to the regional order. Consequently, the very same grouping that the United States is bolstering, like the Quad, like AUKUS, are seen as potential challenges to the diplomatic priorities of Southeast Asia, and certainly raise fair questions about whether Washington respects their concerns. Okay, pivoting then from the security pillar to the prosperity pillar, in the economic sphere, the United States faces the key challenge of trying to guide the region's economic architecture or shape its setting of standards when its relative economic importance to regional economies is diminishing and it sits outside both the CPTPP or the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. Now, during the Trump years, as I mentioned, many countries came to see the United States as focusing on hard security issues instead of economics. And when it did address the latter, it was often protectionist and self-serving. So this is what the situation that Biden's attempting to respond to with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. And the objective of this undertaking, in Biden's own words, is to write the new rules for the 21st century economy, which will help make participating countries grow fairer and faster. Now, to understand this, it's really important to recognize that this initiative is not a trade deal per se. Rather, it's an economic agreement which has four key pillars: supply chain resilience, clean economy, fair economy, and trade. But the latter part, the trade part, is not going to be about negotiating reductions in tariffs, but about setting high standards and rules on things like labor and the environment. Now, obviously, diversification of supply chains is a concern for every country in the region. In particular, there's a desire for things like personal protective equipment and rare earth metals to be sourced from multiple locations. However, I think it would be very fair to say that disappointment was the overwhelming reaction from regional partners when the IPEF was first floated, particularly since it explicitly sought to raise standards without corresponding concessions on trade liberalization. Nevertheless, we saw some concrete action in September 2022 when trade and commerce ministers from 14 different countries, which collectively represent about 40% of world GDP, undertook 2 days of talks in Los Angeles to articulate their objectives of fostering clean, connected, and resilient economies. So how might we assess the prospects for IPEF as part of the Indo-Pacific strategy? I mean, there's certainly fertile ground for American economic engagement in the region. There's a huge desire for American investment. There's a desire for America to play a more active economic role. And the four pillars of IPEF are all topics that countries in the region are themselves interested in and concerned about. So this is not a question of the United States trying to advance an agenda that doesn't resonate. And to its credit, the Biden administration is undertaking a very collaborative process in shaping IPEF that takes on input from countries. This, again, is not the case of there being a fully developed draft agreement that Washington simply plucks down in front of everyone and then twists their arms and gets them to sign up to. And it's conceivable, in theory, that the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is big enough to have a real effect. In terms of both population and combined GDP, for example, the IPEF countries outweigh RCEP, right? So this is a substantial collection of economies. But there are, I would say, some problems we could see looming. Since this is not a traditional trade negotiation, there's some issues both domestically within the United States and participating countries that could pose challenges. Within the US, President Biden has not sought trade promotion authority from Congress, which is basically a commitment to evaluate any agreement on a take it or leave it basis. TPA also identifies in advance very clearly the minimum requirements that would have to be in place for an agreement to be passed by Congress. So without that, there's always the risk of congressional interference or pushback on a line-by-line basis once a negotiation concludes. Now, if Biden decides to bypass Congress and make IPEF an executive agreement, it could certainly come into force in the short term, but there's no guarantee that future presidents will honor it. Amongst participating countries negotiating a standard trade agreement, they negotiate this as a single undertaking, right? The effort is only concluded when agreement has been reached across the board. And this creates space for compromise, right? Countries can trade off in certain pillars or chapters of an agreement in order to craft something that is acceptable to everyone. But IPEF is not being negotiated in this manner. It appears that each individual pillar will be tackled separately. So not only does this prevent you from making trade-offs across the whole of the agreement, countries don't necessarily have to take part in the entire thing. So India, for example, is one of the major economies involved, and it's participating in discussions on clean energy and anti-corruption and supply chain resilience, but it's staying out of the discussions on digital trade and data because the ideas being floated conflict with their own conceptions of data governance. So states don't necessarily have to do things that they don't want to do. On the one hand, then these IPEF negotiations may deliver new trade standards that support, resilient supply chains and cleaner economies across a substantial portion of the world. But at the same time, there are fears, in the words of one former US trade negotiator, that IPEF ends up being like the WTO's Doha round of negotiations, which went nowhere for 15 years before they were ultimately scrapped. So there's potentially a big upside for this initiative, but a year on, it remains still somewhat vague and unclear how fast it can move forward. And given that this is the foundation for the prosperity pillar of the Indo-Pacific strategy, that's not ideal, right? Particularly at a time in which China's trade with Southeast Asia and India has grown dramatically, despite concern in many of these countries about overexposure to that particular market in the post-pandemic era. I think, to be blunt, the United States is really struggling contending with the effects of geography. And without the lure of further access to the American market as an incentive, it's not clear how much influence Washington can have on the region's economic architecture. Okay, so to take the conversation then back to the Indo-Pacific strategy as a whole, just to kind of quickly summarize, on the positive side, Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy advances a very positive vision for the region that in many respects resonates and reflects the priorities for the region itself, in no small part, as I mentioned, because key partners were consulted in the crafting of the strategy. I think aspects of the strategy recognize and encourage the multitude of actors and efforts that are already underway with respect to regional order building, and it seeks to leverage and encourage those. The vision of a network structure of partnerships, for example, much better reflects the region as it is than the hub and spoke space model of US Cold War alliances. I think the strategy, to its credit, is also consistent with key elements of the policies of prior administrations. So we don't have a major zigzag in American policy that raises questions about kind of consistency and steadfastness. I think at the same time, there are concerns that the US is not offering enough on the defense side to deter key challenges, particularly those from China. Some suggest that integrated deterrence is just an excuse not to put more hard power into play or to require US forces to do more with the same level of funding and assets. I think, as I've discussed, it remains to be seen if America's influence can be enough to meaningfully shape rules of the road in absence of trade and investment liberalization. Can an Indo-Pacific economic framework that lacks increased market access compete from far away with a China that is close by, already in RCEP, and seeking to join the CPTPP? And finally, the question about whether or not the Biden administration can remain focused on the Indo-Pacific despite challenges in other parts of the world. We would always hope, of course, that a superpower can walk and crises. Now, the new US national security strategy, which I mentioned, introduced or released in October 2022, sent very positive signals when it gave the Indo-Pacific top billing over Europe. However, we can see that since the invasion of the Ukraine, the United States has provided more than $23 billion in military assistance, which dwarfs the amount that they're currently spending to maintain or restore the comparative military advantage of the United States with respect to China and the Indo-Pacific. So I think we have to say on that front, the jury's still out. Christoph, back to you.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you very much for this very comprehensive and detailed presentation. Is half an hour only. So we can now have a better view of differences and similarities between the Trump strategy and Biden's approach of the Indo-Pacific, and your assessment of Biden's approach in terms of security and prosperity is very, very interesting. I'm sure we will have questions on that front. I will invite again people to ask their question in the Q&A box, but I will initiate the conversation by following in the same direction. There is one dimension of the Trump strategy that we could revisit by looking at this famous notion of decoupling. You know, that was one of the terms that Trump used. He invited the American business and the Western business at large to leave China and to reinvest elsewhere, possibly in the Indo-Pacific. How is this motto today seen by, first of all, the corporate sector, and not only the White House or the State Department, but the corporate sector? And we may of course look at this in the context of the IPEF, because it can be part of the same vision. What can we start with this first question?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think there is a realization of the risks, an increased realization of the risks of being overly dependent and overly reliant on a single market or a single production hub for many types of industries and businesses. But I think the key challenge is that these are not alternative arrangements that one can bring about overnight. And furthermore, depending very much on the industry and the technology that we're talking about, you know, ecosystems have to exist of not just manufacturers, but suppliers and fabricators and designers, and all of these things have to come together. And at present, you know, there are limited range of countries where changes could make place. So Vietnam is talked about as a potential alternative. We're seeing efforts in parts of India. There's a new, you know, semiconductor fabrication efforts around Bangalore. And so it's possible that over time this will take place. And I think for just setting aside politics, for standard corporate risk management reasons, there will be incentives to do so. But I don't think we can expect it to be something that happens so quickly. Now, ironically, then this leads, and this was another example that I wanted to cite. So I'm glad you gave me an opportunity to do so. There is the you know, the problem of well-intentioned efforts. So one of the things that the Biden administration has recently done was try to create incentives for this diversification through the Inflation Reduction Act, which created a range of incentives for producing rechargeable batteries, electric car materials, and so forth within the United States. Well, this now has created anger with Europe, with South Korea, and with a range of other countries, because these are now seen as illegal or anti-competitive subsidies. So, you know, even trying to take steps to do something that we might in the big picture see as being a positive, which is diversification and resilience, can still create problems with the very partners you're hoping to work with.
Yeah, and in fact, diversification is the word you've used as probably the one replacing decoupling, and that's something. And that's something we see.
I think there's a recognition too that the effects of, you know, assuming decoupling were even possible, right? We're talking about economies that become so intertwined, and decoupling would suggest, you know, wielding a battle axe rather than a surgeon's scalpel. So even if it were possible to do so, you know, there have been projections that the effects on secondary markets, so a lot of Southeast Asian economies which provide intermediary goods or intermediary steps in the process themselves would potentially be devastated by the loss of economic opportunities. So it's, I mean, these networks are complex and they cannot be easily unraveled.
Yeah, this is what the Europeans are realizing as well, including the Germans, clearly. You have, in your presentation, Walter, referred to some countries in some detail. India is very clear. The India-US relations are not that easy, not that simple, and you showed that very clearly. Same with ASEAN countries. Now, if you add to list the countries the US look at their number one partners, I mean, number one, number two partners in this region. There are other countries, probably more reliable, quote unquote. What would be these countries and what can be achieved with them? Of course, I think about Japan, I think about Australia, but I may be wrong. What are the number one and number two, so to speak, in the region, and what can be done with them?
Well, I would concur with that on the basis, in no small part, that these are formal treaty allies of the United States who cooperate militarily, in close intelligence cooperation with Australia through the Five Eyes. Japan benefits somewhat from that process. And I think there are meaningful things that can be done. I mean, particularly around the forward deployed forces in Japan. You know, a big debate now surrounds sort of what kind of exposure those facilities have in the face of a Chinese missile threat. And this was the question of sort of rebasing and hardening and things that need to go on to keep these power projection nodes viable. There's also discussions, and it's very helpful, you know, as Japan is moving more towards the front foot on some of its defense posture issues. There are opportunities for the Japanese military, particularly its Air Force, to, you know, take up some of the roles that US may have played in the past about keeping airspace open and such, that would free American assets to focus on other missions. You know, Australia has perceived a political threat from China principally, but now increasingly security, and is looking in part through the AUKUS arrangement to create a more robust naval capability, one that at least could be somewhat defensive. At the end of the day, however, when you compare to the country you already mentioned, India, when you look at things like population, when you look at things like future economic potential and trends, you know, there are limits to what you can do with Australia simply because of Australia's size, because of the size of its population. Japan, I think people often underweight in terms of the kind of capable actor it could be, but we know that, you know, in the aggregate, the population is shrinking. The economy has had challenges for multiple decades now, perhaps previewing China's future. So that's why the look to India, which comparatively is still has, we would hope, a major growth trajectory ahead of it, both on population-wise and economic-wise, would offer a real boost and you know, fits well with the other three countries of the Quad.
Yeah. Do you think Japan could join AUKUS and create what we've heard of lately, JAUKUS? Would it make sense? Is it feasible?
So I don't know enough about the ways in which this would interact with sort of the political culture in Japan. You know, we were talking offline about the particular role that Shinzo Abe played as a leader in moving Japan forward in so many key ways. And just as a non-Japanese person and not a specialist on Japan, it's hard for me to evaluate the sort of emotional ties to surrounding things like nuclear energy, even submarines that don't carry nuclear weapons, but carry, if we're talking about the submarine part, I think that would be difficult to evaluate. If we're setting that aside and recognizing AUKUS as a technology partnership, that, as some people have argued, you know, the submarines are almost a bit of a distraction, and or they might play the role that the nuclear reactors did in the India-US strategic partnership, right? We're still looking for those Westinghouse nuclear power plants to show up in India, but that lays the groundwork for more serious cooperation. So if we're talking about things like quantum computing, artificial intelligence, things like that, I think Japan would be incredibly well placed, as would France and other countries. I know despite the past difficulties, but those areas of emerging technology, I think, would be a very good fit.
Yeah, certainly. We'll return to Japan for sure. We'll devote one full webinar to Japan's view of the Indo-Pacific. One last question from my side, and I hope others will have additional questions. You've not mentioned Taiwan so much. If I was provocative, I would ask a very blunt question, such as, are Americans prepared to die for Taiwan? I mean, of course, that's a way to ask the question. How far is the commitment?
It's a great question. I think it's one that it's one that a lot of American strategic planners wrestle with, because the projections that come out about what a conflict would look like are bad. I think they're bad all around. The most recent kind of collection of war games coming out of the Center for Strategic International Studies basically suggested you'd have a situation in both the US navies and the Chinese navies would be essentially crippled, several aircraft carriers sunk, thousands dead. And it's not clear that the United States is ready to go there. This isn't there isn't an ironclad commitment to Taiwan's defense. It is somewhat ambiguous, and I think a lot depends on the steps that the Taiwanese themselves take to prepare, right? There's been long periods of time in which American defense and strategic planners are arguing or articulating things that have been referred to as sort of hedgehog strategies. Make yourselves really difficult, buy submarines, buy anti-ship cruise missiles and smart mines on a high scale. And then you saw, continued investment in, say, surface platforms that would, in theory, be sunk within the first, seconds of a conflict and didn't seem particularly serious. I think as Taiwan is taking further steps to protect itself and enhance itself, that, we're seeing more willingness to support. Now, would that look like American efforts to actively intervene with the conflict? Would it look more like Ukraine? So maybe there was sort of support in keeping sea lanes open and a massive push of equipment. I think a lot depends on the way in which the particular conflict came about. And I think that would set very important context. But I mean, the short answer, honestly, is I don't know.
Yeah, but do you see the Pentagon and other power centers on the same page there? I mean, in each of the countries we are scrutinizing, we see some institutions in the driver's seat more willingly than others in this Indo-Pacific business. Who is in the driver's seat in the US, if anybody?
Oh, with respect to the Indo-Pacific or Taiwan particularly?
Well, both.
Okay. So certainly with respect to the Indo-Pacific, the Department of Defense plays a major role, right? I mean, it is the forward presence, the resources and things at the disposal of the commander of Indo-Pacific Command certainly dwarf that of any regional ambassador or assistant secretary of state for a region. They are there, they are capable, and again, militaries tend to see things in a strategic manner. So whereas I would be thinking about Taiwan in the realm of a nascent democracy, important economy to the world, what would it mean not to uphold that? If you're a strategic planner sitting at Indo-Pacific Command, you would look at what they call the first island chain, which is the sort of string of islands, Japan down through Taiwan, down to the Philippines, constraining, and basically recognize that if Taiwan were to come under control of the People's Liberation Army Navy, they would have an unfettered outlet to the Pacific Ocean. They would have the ability to put significant pressure on Japan's southern islands, that this is actually a major hub. There's some, and I would agree with this, who argue that actually that would definitely free assets and resources for China to focus attention much more consistently and concertedly towards the Indian Ocean. So countries like India should actually care quite a bit about Taiwan, because the power projection platform that creates, for most of the People's Republic's history, it's been talked about the unsinkable aircraft carrier just sitting off of its coast as a threat. Well, that suddenly gets flipped around, and it's potentially a power projection concern for all of the neighboring countries. So, that conversation is happening at the level of the Pentagon and why the Indo-Pacific strategy matters. I think state and other places, including the National Security Council, are shaping this conversation, but they're trying to bring in more of the economic piece. And I think because the DoD is so big and bureaucratically is so influential, it's often why we see the security piece sort of outweigh the economic offer when these strategies get put together. Also, there's the issue of politics, right? Presumably, a strategic thinker who is unfettered by domestic politics would want and recognize the need for a much more robust economic part of this particular strategy. But the politics of President Biden's Democratic Party is not one in which lowering tariffs or increasing foreign investment is going to be particularly fair. So Congress gets a vote as well.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very interesting additional sociology of decision-making processes, and we need that as well. So Mauro will open his mic to ask you a question directly, Walter, and then we'll have two questions in the chat box.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon from Delhi. Thank you, Walter, for your very interesting presentation. A quick question about the European Union. As you know, the EU published the strategy from the Indo-Pacific. I wanted to ask you, what's the approach from the United States side? So is there a debate about the European Union as an actor in the Indo-Pacific versus the individual states? Or is it how is it evaluated, the fact that the EU is trying to operate by itself? And the other question I wanted to ask you was more related to the future. As you know, the People's Republic of China is growing its influence in the European Union, especially with certain countries, and there's a huge debate going on about this. Do you see this coming in the wider picture of the US approach to the Indo-Pacific? Is it something that at some point it will have to be addressed in a more integrated way? Thank you.
So with respect to the first question, I'd say it's actually both. So the US is welcoming the European Union as an institution, and specifically, referenced in the Biden strategy is encouraging Europe, the EU, to do more, while also focusing particularly on France and the UK as actors that have both historical stakes, regional presence, and interests. So I don't necessarily see it as one or the other in that respect. And the United States, I think is broadly seeking, as I said, in this concept of a lattice work of networks and partnerships to increase as many of the partners that share broadly the vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. So it hasn't at this point gotten to, it hasn't reached a stage where you would sort of see trade-offs, right? Well, if we work with the French bilaterally, how does that hurt Europe? That hasn't been an issue to date. It might conceivably, I can't off the top of my head think about how it might come about, but it could. I do think just writ large, the United States is concerned at what has been seen to be a degree of political or economic subversion. So whether it's the revelations as to the influence operations in Australia, or the inroads that have been made in countries like Italy and elsewhere, port deals and such, are concerns. Now, at the end of the day, I mean, these countries are making their own decisions, but I think certainly the United States would never want to see the European Union end up kind of going down the route of ASEAN, where you would identify, and we openly identify specific ASEAN countries that are essentially stalking horses or vetoes for Beijing, that if suddenly, again, Italy or Greece or something like that were to sort of be blocking any EU initiative in the Indo-Pacific, that would be an important issue.
Thank you, Walter. Two questions. We have 10 minutes left, and we will bracket them together to make sure that you can respond. One by Kud Wong from the War Studies. Trumpian phenomenon cause inconsistency in US foreign policy, and the influences still exist even though Biden government has tried to engage in another Indo-Pacific policy. So what are the approaches that Biden did or will do to counter Trumpian influences? And Rajesh Basrur asked, given the tension between strategic competition on the one hand and strategic and economic interdependence on the other, it appears alliance-like arrangements have reached their limit with respect to the Indo-Pacific. Is a coordinated working approach by the Quad to build the security and economic capacities of smaller states one way forward to building a modified regional order? And this question harks back to the minilateral question that you are so much interested in, Walter, yeah. I know. So the floor is yours.
Sure. Okay. So on the first, I think one of the things that that Biden has done and the Biden administration has done is to try to go out to listen and to engage with countries in the region. And so, as I mentioned, the development of this Indo-Pacific strategy is in of itself indicative of an approach where ideas were vetted, partners were consulted. This isn't something that was, simply drawn up in the, the National Security Council sitting in the Eisenhower Old Executive Office building without any sort of regional input. Then there was an effort, and it's been slow, to try to show engagement. So President Biden did travel to the region. There were critiques last year about the slow pace of appointing ambassadors to key countries. India aside, that has all been resolved. We do have, U.S. ambassadors in place, and the agendas being put forth are largely in line with, as I mentioned, regional interests, and are dealing with topics that countries there care about. There's an attempt to try to create mutually beneficial economic engagement, which of course is a far cry from the sort of protectionist orientation of the Trump administration. And there's an attempt to sort of rebuild the trust and relations of partners, coercing the South Korea, trying to, coerce more money out of the South Koreans, or, pressure the Japanese. They're trying to take a different way. So, we should recognize, and you'd be foolish if you're a U.S. policymaker not to recognize that real damage was done, that trust was harmed, but that there are enduring interests and enduring similarities of outlooks, and those can, I think, lay the foundation for continued partnership and cooperation. With respect to Rajesh's question, great question, Rajesh, and I do think that you point to a real benefit of more flexible multilateral groupings. And again, I would return particularly to using ASEAN as a key example here with this coordinated networking approach, right? For various political and historical reasons, Australia has difficulties engaging certain Southeast Asian nations. The United States, partnering or going along with initiatives by the United States, or where the United States is seen to be on the front end, may be politically sensitive. Japan, by contrast, is an extremely trusted, seen as a respectful power and respectful partner in Southeast Asia. There is, at least rhetorically, a desire for India to play a much more active role. So when you think about a framework like the Quad, there may be I hate to use the phrase divide and conquer, but delegation of responsibilities, where for certain types of initiatives and types of partnerships, you may want to put an Indo-Japanese face on it and let those two countries sort of take the lead in working with key actors, because they have higher levels of trust and higher levels of receptivity than, US-Australian initiative might. So I do think that a modified regional order, disaggregated but coordinated approaches could be a very viable tool.
Thank you. And the last question is by Wei Chen Lai, and it says, do you think the US would think it is worth investing military aid or even fighting for Taiwan for the importance of either Taiwan's strategic role or situation or the first island chain for the US? We are back to Taiwan and we'll close on this.
Do I think the US think it's important? I think they absolutely do think it's important. There's no question that the attempts to bolster Taiwan's resilience and the delivery of military aid, and perhaps undertaking initiatives along the lines of what went on with respect to the Ukrainian military after 2014 would make sense. Taiwan, I mean, I'm not saying that we're going to have a war strictly over semiconductors, though if you imagine sort of that particular industry in Taiwan being devastated, the global implications of that are pretty horrific, which of course makes it hard for me to envision a conflict in the first place. But I think when you layer over the strategic rationale plus the role of norms and the idea that, you know, a democratic polity would potentially be snuffed out, you know, I absolutely could see a decision to use force. I'm not saying that would be guaranteed, but I definitely think they would see it as worth it. And particularly if you think you could harden or bolster Taiwan to a point where it could largely, you know, survive or create enough of a problem to you know, engage in deterrence by denial without having to actively intervene, that would sound like a wonderful opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Walter, for this great presentation and for this great interaction in the Q&A session. We are now much more enlightened, and we can make sense much more easily of what the US are doing in the Indo-Pacific. So for those who missed the beginning of this presentation, the link to the website where the recording of this session is in the chat box. Do not hesitate to copy and paste and disseminate this link. You can also watch Natasha's presentation on Russia by using the same link that was last month. And I can also mention what we will do next month. Arch Pont from the ORF and of course from King's College as well will scrutinize the Indian Indo-Pacific strategy, and that will be on the 24th of February at 12 noon GMT UK time. So I hope you will also be connected on that day at that time. Thank you again, Walter, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.